Right, so Keir Starmer and Emily Thornberry, most notably amongst our politicians, it has to be said, possibly because both of them are lawyers. Thornberry, a former Shadow Foreign Secretary, as well as the current Shadow Attorney General. Starmer, arguably most pertinently, being a former human rights lawyer, who again demonstrating he probably wasn't a very good one, as both are unable, it seems, to call a war crime, are unable to state in no uncertain terms that collective punishment, which Israel are meting out on Palestine when they are supposedly targeting Hamas, yet are widely killing hundreds of civilians indiscriminately, it seems, as they do so. Terrorist acts on both sides need to be called exactly that. You cannot pick and choose whose human rights you value more. Who are you to do that? Yet that seems to be the Labour position. The position of others too, who I will make mention of, and yes, there absolutely is fallout from this from within the Labour Party too, horrified by their leadership's response. Right, so anyone else sick of the words Israel has a right to defend itself, becoming the rote response from our politicians and media collective talking heads? Collective responsibility in supporting collective punishment seems to be the attitude. And Keir Starmer has exemplified that better than most of the last couple of days. His devotion to Israel comes without equivocation, as we know, is unquestioning, and that seemingly supersedes the fact he was a human rights lawyer. Though, of course, that has always depended on whose human rights, because he has got a history of picking and choosing. He never gave a second thought for the human rights of Julian Assange, for instance, as he went above and beyond at the CPS to try and get him deported to Sweden, telling Swedish officials do not get cold feet. There was that US extradition virtually guaranteed to happen afterwards, wasn't there? There was no apparent consideration for the human rights of Jean-Charles de Menezes, an unarmed man shot dead after a botched Met Police operation overseen by the later Met Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, when he let her off the hook, seemingly on the grounds it would have damaged her career. Look at what the Met has become under her watch. What a pity her career didn't get stunted, a lot of people might be thinking. So should we really be surprised when he says in no uncertain terms he supports war crimes as long as it is Israel committing them, because that is okay? Nick Ferrari on LBC asked Keir Starmer, the siege is appropriate, cutting off power, cutting off water secure? To which he received the answer, I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation. Obviously everything should be done within international law, but I don't want to step away from the sort of core principles that Israel has a right to defend herself, and Hamas bears responsibility for these terrorist acts, and I would call on all responsible states, particularly Middle East responsible states, to call this out for what it is and to stand with the world in condemning these actions by Hamas. First things first, if you had an ounce of a clue about what was going on, you absolute balloon of a man, you would know that the surrounding states are all Muslim, all Arab states, and they've historically always supported Palestine. Egypt, notably, has always been a go-between between Israel and Palestine, and they've been going in with packs on their backs, people from Egypt voluntarily taking food and water into Gaza, despite the fact that Egyptian-Gaza border has just been bombed. If Israel has a right to defend herself, let's consider that, though, in its most basic terms there. Because if that's the case, then so does Palestine. Just because the West refuses to recognise a Palestinian state doesn't make it untrue. And as occupied territory under international law, you quote, but clearly do not understand, they have the right to defend themselves with violence if needs be. In no way does that make me a supporter of Hamas or of the killings they are responsible for. They should be condemned just as much as Israeli killings are, because both are equally wrong. But don't try and excuse the politics and the actions that have brought us to this point, because the likes of Hamas, the likes of Hezbollah in Lebanon, came into being as a direct consequence of Israeli invasion and atrocity. They exist because of Israel and because of their past conduct. And Starmer can gloss over that at every turn if he likes, and he absolutely will. I don't think there is another UK politician more devoted to Israel than he is, but it doesn't change the facts. But the most disturbing thing of all that he said was that Israel are within their rights to cut off power and water, which is collective punishment, and is itself a war crime. It is illegal and a war crime under the same international law he also brought up, making it abundantly obvious he isn't familiar with it, and as a human rights lawyer, he really ought to be. That or he is, and knows he's talking rubbish, and he's going to carry on doing it anyway. Because surely this is one of the basics he should know as a human rights lawyer. Just how crap of a lawyer was he if he didn't know that, and how nasty and vindictive a politician he is if he does. If he doesn't understand collective punishment is a war crime, well, he isn't the only politician falling into that trap, though. And I'm not going to exclusively pick on Labour here, but I am going to address Emily Thornberry too, the Shadow Attorney General, next, because again, she's a lawyer. She's in a judicial shadow ministerial post. And her interview on Newsnight I thought slightly different, because the look on her face told me she knew what she was saying was drivel, but she was basically willingly selling her soul for a future ministerial car and going along with Starmer's apparent ignorance anyway. She got the Victoria Derbyshire treatment on Newsnight, and she was confronted with the Geneva Convention of 1949, although Derbyshire referenced Protocols 1 and 2, which were passed in 1977, enhancing the protections of civilians, which of course is the relevant international law we're all talking about here. Though whether this was what Starmer was referring to, I can't say. His apparent ignorance of it all, I doubt he could have named it if he'd been asked to. Anyway, Article 54 thereof of the Geneva Convention, Protocols 1 and 2 applied, states, starvation of civilians as a method of warfare is prohibited. Derbyshire asked her, in light of her obvious familiarity with this act, being a lawyer herself, was Starmer right in saying Israel had the right to cut off power and water to Palestine? Well, Thornberry just came out with Israel are the victims, and that overused line which is getting on my tripe now, which is Israel has the right to defend itself. That planes can't land in Tel Aviv, well, that's because Israeli airspace has to be cleared for Israel to use its Iron Dome defence system, itself allegedly now compromised. That's a rabbit hole to go down as to how you believe that might have happened. But not once would she say Israel did or did not have the right to cut off power and water. 3 times Derbyshire asked her. 3 times she danced the politician's dance and answered another question entirely. Utterly shameful. She should be embarrassed, because in her case, I truly believe she does know better. I think she's too afraid of being sacked by Starmer if she told the truth and said otherwise. Others are far less shameless, though. Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, let's will in the Tories here. He's always a national source of shame as well. Israel have, as many will already know, ordered the entirety of Gaza City, the northernmost largest settlement in the Gaza Strip, to be evacuated of its 1.1 million inhabitants within 24 hours. It's literally half the population of Gaza, already one of the most densely populated parts of the world, to move into the south of the Strip, doubling the overcrowding. It's not like people can escape from the south either, because Israel has already bombed the access to Egypt via the Rafah border crossing. This I'm going to go into in another video, I think. There's too much to say on this in just one in this video as well. But back to Shapps. His response to this insane evacuation diktat and whether our government supports the order led to him saying, yes, that line again, Israel has the right to defend itself. That sentence has become the go-to excuse for anything, but keeps ignoring the fact Palestine has the same right and they're an occupied territory. Israel has been in violation of international law itself for decades by occupying and seizing land that is not theirs, covered in Geneva Convention Articles 42 through to 56, incidentally. Though admittedly occupation isn't very well defined in it, weirdly enough, possibly why Israel has got away with it for so long. Other politicians have come out to bat for Israel too, however. Ursula von der Leyen of the EU is one, despite the collective punishment being meted out. Interestingly enough, last year when Russia attempted this in Ukraine, though, she tweeted out, Russia's attacks against civilian infrastructure, especially electricity, are war crimes. Cutting off men, women and children of water, electricity and heating, with winter coming, these are acts of pure terror, and we have to call it as such. Well, you won't now it's Palestine, though, will you? Speaking of Ukraine, though, Volodymyr Zelensky is another, considering a trip to Israel in solidarity, it is being reported. But in response to his own country being attacked by Putin, he was quite vociferous on Twitter too, saying, there must be no famine, the right to food and clean water should be the basic human right, it must be a global goal. Anyone who tries to deprive people of food or water is an enemy to humanity. We must defeat such enemies like Ukraine, and our partners do. I strongly suggest you don't visit Israel then, if that's how you really feel. The BBC let us down repeatedly this week with all the war coverage going on. They've just had their front doors defaced with red paint because of it. They chose to platform on Question Time this week, of all people, Jake Wallace-Simons, the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, an avowedly pro-Zionist newspaper, who got called out on the show over a tweet he put out, which he had the brass neck to still deny. But in this era of screenshots, he can't get away with saying, and he indeed said, we need to face reality. Much of Muslim culture is in the grip of a death cult that sacralises bloodshed. Not all, but many Muslims are brainwashed by it. This is a big part of the problem. Islamophobic much? But that's fine to platform on the BBC because he'll be out to bat for Israel. Nonetheless, there are those who have spoken out and railed against what is desperately trying to be promoted as the mainstream national narrative, let's call it, not least of which millions of people, it seems, up and down this country today, marching in the streets, London, Newcastle, Sheffield, Liverpool, more places than that, with Palestinian flags, giving Suella Braverman a big flip of the bird to her narrative that people flying that flag, it should be criminalised and arrested. Far be it from me, though, to want to give a Tory props over all of that, though. But Alicia Kearns, a backbencher, has tweeted out in response to reports that Israel has been using white phosphorus. And she said, white phosphorus use in densely populated civilian areas is a war crime. Why? Because it effectively rains down fire, because of how indiscriminate it is, and because it is so very difficult to extinguish. It sticks to skin and burns deep, even through human bone and metal. Multiple news agencies have reported that this is happening. It needs confirming, because if so, that's yet another war crime. Starmer and Thornberry have both been publicly embarrassed too, as the BAME officer of Young Labour, Lubaba Khalid, herself a Palestinian, resigned with a scathing letter, reading, "It is with a heavy heart that today I have handed in my resignation from my role as Young Labour BAME officer. As a Palestinian with direct family in Gaza, I am absolutely appalled by the comments made to LBC by the leader of the Labour Party and my local MP, Keir Starmer, who said that Israel has the right to withhold water and electricity. Collective punishment is a war crime under international law. This position was then reaffirmed by Emily Thornberry. I have spent the last few days worried about the safety of my family, and with the electricity now cut off and communication limited, these worries are only exacerbated. I have received zero support from the Labour Party, a common theme experienced by other Muslim and Palestinian members. The comments from the leadership this week have been the last straw. I can only conclude that the Labour Party is no longer a safe space for Palestinians and Muslims." She's hardly the first Muslim to say that. That's damning, though. That letter is absolutely scathing. In amongst far too many really poorly judged, really terrible commentaries on this ongoing mess in the Middle East, Starmer's has to be amongst the worst. A human rights lawyer, it would appear, with no idea that collective punishment is a war crime. But it shouldn't actually even take a legal background to recognise that punishing civilians for the actions of others is wrong. 2.3 million people in the Gaza Strip, and it's okay to punish them all while siding with their oppressors just to put the boot in that little bit more. Since 2008, some 156,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza and the West Bank. Some 6,000 Israelis have died in that time as well. So it's hardly even-handed. It's hardly a fair fight. But every one of those deaths, regardless of which side they happened on, is as tragic as it was preventable. It's no good siding with Israel come hell or high water, as Starmer seems intent on, because it's giving the green light to genocide if boundaries and laws put in place to prevent it are not upheld, as seems to be the very real danger here. Thanks for watching. I hope you found the video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Do also leave a comment and be part of the conversation on all of this as well. Do have your say. Meanwhile, here's a video recommendation where the comparisons and hypocrisy being exposed on the Israel-Palestine conflict versus that going on in Ukraine hasn't been lost on some, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.